we'll start with a welcome to the Evergreen Bed and Breakfast Club virtual travel experience. This week, I am really excited to introduce Hugh Grinnell, who is one of our members in Tucson, and he is going to share the history of the founding of Glacier National Park. And it's based on his relatives' journals and correspondence while he was like mapping and discovering and naming all these different features in the park. And he has, well, a little background on Hugh. Since his retirement in 2004, Hugh has studied the history of the Great American West. And after discovering an old Great Northern Railway passenger car named Grinnell Glacier, he researched the name to discover that the glacier was named to honor the efforts of George Bird Grinnell, a distant cousin, to preserve the area. So Hugh has done extensive research and has given many presentations, and he ended up writing a book about this. And the book actually was published and was supposed to come out in March, right as COVID hit, which sort of curtailed book signings and things like that. And so he has just taken it upon himself to sell the books himself, and if you want to buy one, there'll be some information at the end, and he'll dedicate the book to whoever you want to have it. I ordered one hoping Jack could read it before our presentation, but we're giving it to his brother who lives close to Glacier. He lives in Idaho, and they've been wanting to go hike Glacier National Park. And we had hoped they could come on and join us for tonight's presentation, but that didn't work out. So Hugh, if you want to go ahead and share your screen and get started. Why don't you kind of wave to everybody first so you're dressed up like your relative, and the similarity between Hugh and his distant cousin is really phenomenal. So, is there anything else you want to say before we get started?
No, I just want to make sure we're going to get this screen up the way we're supposed to.
Sure, we will.
Follow your lead. Okay,
so you can go ahead and take the screen share, and I'm going to be quiet.
Can you speak up? I couldn't hear you very well. Or get closer to the screen. Speak up and let me hear you say something.
I can, sure, I'll be talking a lot.
Can you be a little bit louder?
I am very loud right now.
Can you make the volume on your computer louder?
It's up at the top.
Okay. Well, everybody turn up the volume on your own computer then. Okay. Well, we've got the right screen, and so if Hugh wants to go ahead and take over, I'm excited about this.
Well, as you can see, this presentation and the book are using the words of George Bird Grinnell, my cousin. And I'll be talking about his discoveries and explorations from 1885 to 1898, and the creation of the national park and its development from 1891 to 1927. His words are taken directly from his field journals, his published articles. There were 49 of them between 1885 and 1890, and his personal correspondence with members of his expeditions, some friends, and U.S. government officials. Now, this presentation is taken from the same sources from which I wrote the book, but this presentation comprises only about 8% of the story. The whole story is in the book. So my name is George Bird Grinnell. I was named after my cousin George Bird. My friends called me Bird. My close friends at Yale called me Birdie, which is interesting because I received a degree in ornithology from Yale. In 1877, my soon-to-be lifetime friend and guide, James Willard Schultz, left his home in Boonville, New York as a teenager to visit an uncle in St. Louis and to work in his hotel. Schultz eventually met a group of traders who invited him to join their excursion up the Missouri River. They traveled 2,000 miles to Fort Benton, just east of the Rockies. He became associated with Joseph Kipp at his trading post. Schultz lived with a small band of Blackfeet Indians known as the Small Robes. He learned their language and customs. In Running Crane, their chief gave Schultz the name Apakuni, which means spotted white robe, which was actually a bit of an insult because Schultz bought the buffalo robe from traders and it was very poorly tanned with white spots. He married an Indian named Nataki in 1879. He lived with the Small Robes, he hunted with them, he fought with them, he buried their dead, and he welcomed them into his lodge with Nataki. He eventually became fluent in the Blackfeet language. About this time, he began to write articles about his life as an Indian, and he sent his articles to 3 magazines, including Forest and Stream, of which I was the editor at the time. In 1880, Schultz had submitted an article to Forest and Stream entitled Hunting in Montana, which I published in the October 1880 issue. In early 1885, he submitted another article entitled To Chief Mountain, in which he described hunting bighorn sheep and mountain goats and catching 12-pound trout in lakes that were walled in by stupendous mountains. Well, his story about the trout was enough bait to make me want to visit him. I was hooked, if you'll pardon the puns. In August of 1885, I made my first visit to the area. The Blackfeet called it the Walled-In Lakes. That was to be my annual destination for over 40 years. I left New York, and after a week's pause in Yellowstone, I took the Northern Pacific train to Helena. Then I took a mail stage. Then I took a mail stage and rode 116 miles further to Fort Benton, where I was met by my correspondent friend Schultz. We then traveled by wagon train to the Blackfeet Agency. Well, this was a hunting and fishing trip. So Schultz, in a mixed blood Blackfeet Indian, Charlie Rose, known as Yellowfish, agreed to be my guides for a couple of weeks. The first day we secured 2 saddle horses at Cutbank Creek. We traveled north from the Blackfeet Agency on horseback into the St. Mary's Valley to the area that I was to explore for the next 14 years. We hunted and fished for 2 weeks. This activity was necessary because our food supply consisted only of bacon, flour, sugar, salt, and tobacco. We needed meat to subsist. On our 4th day, September 4th, as soon as it stopped snowing, we packed up at about 9:30 in the morning. We pulled out. The upper lake is quite different from the lower lake in that here are majestic mountains which come down in steps, almost sloping on the natural outer walls to the water's edge. These lakes are evidently glacial in their origin, and great masses of snow suggest the presence of a few small glaciers still remaining. We worked down the slopes until we came to the head of the lake where we made camp. On September 8th, after we'd eaten supper, 4 Kootenai Indians rode into camp, each with a sheep on his saddle. This fairly made me foam at the mouth with envy. They said that they'd killed them on a mountain east of the upper lake. 2 days later, 2 different and younger Kootenays rode up to our camp and proposed to go hunting. Well, because of our recent experience with bad weather and bad hunting, no one seemed to care to go except myself. And so, saddling my horse Jerry, we were soon on the way toward a mountain where we had had no luck previously. As I rode along, I wondered how I would communicate with the Indians. I'm not especially proficient in sign language. I tried to explain to them that I was a poor climber and that they would have to go slowly to have me keep up. To this, they seemed to agree. But when we came to the mountain, they started off and left me far behind. Soon, they were out of sight. It began to snow again and blow and was very cold. I performed my customary operation of sitting on a rock and shivering. After perhaps an hour and a half, I heard 3 shots. I started off in the direction where the reports came from. After going a mile or more, I stopped to look and listen. I then saw the head of a sheep appear, coming toward me over a ridge. I had slowly sunk down by a big rock as soon as I saw it. It stopped at about 200 yards, and once again about 100 yards, and then ran swiftly by. I tried to shoot, but the snow blew so thickly that I could not see the sights of my rifle. A third time it stopped, this time at about 150 yards and behind a pile of rocks so that I could see only its head and neck. I knew that it was now or never, so I fired. The wild bound that the animal gave assured me that my shot had told. I hurried to a point where it had passed along. Some spots of blood told the story. The trail was an easy one to take, and as I went on, the blood was more abundant. At length, looking down over a ridge, I saw the game stretched out on its side. It was quite dead. After butchering the animal, it was a 2-year-old ewe. I wondered how I was to carry 100 pounds of meat on my 125-pound frame. I finally threw the animal on my back and began the ascent of the mountain. By frequently stopping to take a breath, I at last made about half the ascent. 4 times I sat down and placed the meat on a rock and took a long rest. I finally made it to the horses at the same time the 2 Indians arrived. Packing the meat on the horses, we were soon at camp. When I told the story to Schultz, he said,
"That mountain shall be called Single Shot Mountain from this day forth."
On September 14th, we left the St. Mary's Valley to start a 2-day excursion to the Swift Current Creek in Valley. Something's not working. There we go. Following the creek, we passed 4 small lakes, yet I thought of names for them. I came up with First Lake, Second Lake, Third Lake, and Fourth Lake. And we camped at a much larger lake, which I named a Fifth Lake. Our breakfast that morning consisted of a couple of damp biscuits due to a pack horse falling on its back yesterday while climbing out of a stream and attempting to climb a steep bank. He fell squarely on the pack into the strong current where he rolled a half dozen times, drenching all our bedding, our food, and other supplies. After drying our gear overnight, seeing a tall mountain, we rode to it, leaving the horses at the base in a grassy area. I named the mountain Point Mountain, which we climbed to get a good view of the area around us. From the southwest slope, I looked directly at a mountain with a majestic look, which I named Mount Wilbur, for Mr. E.R. Wilbur, the longtime treasurer of the Forest and Stream Publishing Company. The following day, we rode into the South Valley to explore the glacier that we saw. We came upon a sixth lake. The waters of this new lake are green and milky, true glacial waters. Very impressive is the superb mountain which lies between these two bodies of water. Behind this mountain and over this new lake, the glacier was visible. We could see at least a mile of its width, and how much was hidden from view we could not conjecture. The thickness of this mass of ice we estimated at several hundred feet, but we could only guess at this. Our talk that night was of the superb mountains about us, of the great masses of ice that furrow their sides, and of the possibilities of meat for the morrow. As we talked, the pipes kept going well. There was plenty of wood. We lounged about and chatted or dozed until at length, one by one, we crept into our blankets and the wind sang our lullaby. Since we were out of supplies, we began our trek home. I couldn't wait to return to the ice. Early in October of 1887, about a glowing campfire on the shores of Upper St. Mary's Lake are seated three persons. George Gould, the brother of a good friend of mine from my Yale days. Schultz, who I call by his Blackfeet name, Apakuni, and me. We all met in early October to hunt and fish and to visit the great mass of ice which I discovered in 1885. The weather was cold, snowy, and windy. Not great conditions for hunting, but we needed meat to feed us. We also realized that we needed a fourth man. Schultz knew that his friend Jack Monroe was hunting in the Pike Lake area, a dozen or so miles distant. So he sent me off with directions where I could find him. This I did, and the two of us returned 2 days later. Now, the four of us began our trek into the mountains. On October 13th, the Rhymer, a nickname I had given to Gould because he writes poetry, and Jack were going through thick pine timber on their way up Single Shot when they came on some very fresh bear sign. They followed the tracks, which grew constantly more fresh, and at length they smelled the bear. They went forward as quickly as possible, and yet with the utmost caution. Suddenly, Jack saw the bear 100 yards below them and whispered to the Rhymer.
There he is.
There was no time for investigation, so the rifle jumped to the shoulder and spoke out, but the bear never moved.
Look at it through the glass.
Said the Rhymer in a hollow glass voice, for dreadful doubts began to force themselves upon him. The Rhymer had fired at a bear, but this particular bear, though pierced through and through by the hunter's deadly ball, turned out to be an old black stump. 5 days later, October 29th, Lieutenant John H. Beacom of the 3rd Infantry at nearby Fort Shaw, a dozen or so miles south of the Blackfeet Agency, called on us. My group had determined to start for Swift Current in the morning, and I invited Lieutenant Beacom to join us. The next day, we packed, and by 2 o'clock, we started with 3 pack animals for Swift Current. Lieutenant Beacom accompanied us. We reached our old camp from 2 years before and camped there, for there was an abundance of grass for the horses. We were anxious to get to the ice. So before daylight the next morning, preparations were made to start on an exploring trip to see if a way might be found which would take us to our destination. At length, we reached the head of Fifth Lake and descended to a creek, which reminded me of a horizontal cataract. So I named it Cataract Creek. From here, the glacier was still 4 or 5 miles distant. After taking 1 or 2 photos, Lieutenant Beacom and I mounted our horses and rode up the stream bed toward the ice. At this time, Lieutenant Beacom told me that he was going to name the glacier and the huge mountain around which we rode after me. I protested, and I think he may not carry out his intention. However, I later learned that Lieutenant Beacom was a member of the U.S. Geological Survey. From this point, we had a better view of the ice, far better than anything that had yet been seen, but we were running out of sunlight and needed to return to camp. The next morning, we saddled up and began our trek back to the ice. We had planned to stay 4 or 5 days near the glacier. Lieutenant Beacom had returned to his camp on St. Mary's Lake, and since Gould had left us a few days earlier, Jack, Apicuni, and I made the difficult and slow journey to the face of the glacier. As we climbed toward the glacier, we discovered a 1-mile rounded lake at the foot of the glacier into which a tall water cascaded. The group named it Grinnell Lake. The cliff we wished to ascend was very steep, and at length we reached the bed of the falls. Slowly and carefully we climbed upward, eventually reaching the surface of the glacier. The glacier is comprised of 2 parts. We estimated the vertical thickness of the lower part at 700 feet, and the thickness of the upper mass is perhaps 300 feet. Well, since the glacier slopes dramatically upward, the distance from the bottom of the lower mass to the top of the upper mass occupies not less than 2,000 feet vertically on the mountainside. That is a huge glacier. After a couple hours of walking carefully on the glacier surface and taking a few photographs, Apicuni called out,
See ya! Look at that ram!
I dropped to one knee immediately, raised my rifle, asked Jack how far the distance was, and he said 200 yards. I adjusted my sight quickly and I fired. When the rifle was lowered, the animal had disappeared. Slowly, we moved over the ice to where the ram had stood and discovered great blotches of red blood. Jack followed the trail of blood and 2 hours later found the sheep lying in the snow, dead. That night, we returned to camp with part of the meat and left the rest on the ice. There was just too much to carry. We're going to recover it the following day. Back in camp, when the fire was blazing and the fat sheep meat sputtering in the pan and the coffee pot steaming on the warm ashes, we talked over the incidents of the day. That night, I wrote in my journal, a most important day. We reached the glacier, discovered a new lake, a most beautiful falls, a true moraine at the foot of the glacier, and I killed a superb ram. I named the mountain, whose north slope lay on the glacier, Mount Gould for George Gould, and the small peak at the southeastern wing of the mountain, Monroe's Peak for Jack. We returned to the glacier the next few days to continue to explore its surface and discover its mysteries. 2 weeks after first ascending the glacier, the trip of us rock climbers was over.
Say, Hugh,
Yes,
do you know like the kind of rifle or the gauge, stuff like that?
it was a Sharps rifle. I don't know the gauge.
or caliber?
No,
Okay.
his choice
Okay.
at the time.
Okay. Thank you.
Although I like hunting and fishing, I decided that I would focus more on collecting data toward making a map of this area. If you would have counted noses in 1888 on October 1st, you would have found 6. The chief, Captain Luther North, from my Pawnee days 15 years earlier. The Rhymer, Jack Monroe, Apakuni, myself, and Tail Feathers Coming in Sight Over the Mountain, a half-breed Blackfeet Indian whose everyday name, thank goodness, is Brocky. I brought with me a barometer, a thermometer, and other weather recording instruments. I also brought a compass. After traveling from the agency, we arrived at the foot of the upper Glacier Lake near my glacier where we made our first camp. Both the Rhymer and the chief tasted victory in hunting goats, so we had meat for dinner. In only 1 year, the glacier had changed dramatically. Its surface was soft and everywhere melting. Down the steep slope of the ice hurried a dozen swift torrents, which had worn for themselves deep channels in which they whirled, until at last they plunged into some deep crevice and with hollow moorings and roarings disappeared from view. The ice was slippery beneath our feet, and as its surface was sharply inclined, we were obliged to move very carefully. If a man should fall into one of the deep crevices, he would never be seen again. We had with us a coil of light rope, and with this we tied ourselves together, only one man approaching the crevices at a time. The whole ice mass seemed to shake and quiver. The next day, the clouds were flying over the mountain, and the wind was blowing hard, predicting a storm. 3 more days we remained in the Swift Current Valley before moving to the St. Mary's Lakes. Wednesday it was clear and warmer. At Chinook, a moist, warm wind had begun to blow. Time to dry our blankets and equipment. I turned to more mapping. I named peaks on the southeast side of the lake. The first as you go up the lake on the south side is Red Eagle, already named by Apakuni's wife, Nataki. Red Eagle, her uncle, was a medicine man who had saved their son's life a few years before. Next westward is Four Bears, named after a Mandan chief and grandfather of Joe Kip. Next is Little Chief Mountain, which I named for Luther North, who with his brother Frank were known as Chief and Little Chief by their Pawnee scouts. And finally, Almost a Dog Mountain, named to honor a good friend of mine who was one of only a handful of survivors of the Blackfeet massacre in January of 1870. He also kept count of his fellow Blackfeet who perished during the winter of starvation, 1882 to 83. He cut 555 notches on a large stick to keep track of the dead. Shortly thereafter, I saw a prominent peak in the distance, northwest of my position. I named it Mount Sayi, which in the Blackfeet language means mad dog. This name was later applied to the creek, the glacier, and the pass on or near the mountain. The next few days, the temperature dropped significantly, often measuring 20 degrees or less. On this map, you can see those features that I had just named and what their perspective is with respect to Upper St. Mary Lake. A few days later, Lute returned to his home. The weather remained cold with rain and snow, so I spent time in camp working on my sketch map, which I had started in 1885. I added what I remembered about the Swift Current Valley and the east side of Lower St. Mary's Lake. This sketch map was on one of the pages of my daily journal. The following week, we parted and all returned to our home. I sent a couple of letters to Jack Monroe in 1890. I said, having trouble. I'll be with you in half an hour when this works. I said, I'd not heard from you for a while. I'd begun to think that perhaps you were dead, but it appears that you're only married. On July 18th, I wrote, I understand that you're ready for me whenever I may turn up. I should want Billy Jackson to go around with me and interpret when I visit the Indians. And finally, on July 23rd, it's probable that I should want to start for the lakes about the 1st of September. Well, I arrived at Two Medicine Camp on September 4th at 8 in the evening. Schultz and Billy Jackson arrived about 9 o'clock with our pack animals. We found Jack the next day at an Indian camp. When the weather cooperated, we rode to the Kennedy Creek and established camp. In the morning of September 15th, we rode to the foot of Mount Wilbur. Lying against its vertical cliffs on the north side, which rise without a break thousands of feet above it, lies a little glacier, less than half a mile square, which is constantly pushing out into the lake. Sections of the glacier fall off into the water so that the little lake is dotted with a multitude of tiny icebergs. I named it Glacier Lake. Iceberg Lake, excuse me. On September 17th, we rode past a string of 4 lakes on the North Fork of Swift Current. There are 2 considerable masses of ice on the head of the main fork above the 4 lakes. Right then, I named Swift Current Mountain and Swift Current Glacier. The next day, we returned to our camp at St. Mary's. About noon the next day, we started for the falls of Swift Current. On the way, I got tangled up in down timber and brush. My horse fell on me in the down timber, bruising my leg against a log and holding me so that I could not get out without help. It was very painful. On September 19th, I was too lame to walk, but I could ride. In the morning after breakfast, Jack and I climbed to the highest point behind Rose Basin. We could see everywhere. Glaciers were on almost every mountain. One glacier especially on the South Fork of the St. Mary's River at the westernmost park covers the whole mountain from the summit to as low down as we could see without a break. We had no trouble finding a route to the top of the glacier and spent most of the day exploring it. We estimated its length to be several miles, in its widest part more than 2 miles. Back at camp that evening around the fire, there was considerable discussion of what the glacier should be named. Jackson suggested Pecoonie Glacier, but Schultz thought its name ought to be Kootenai. I was of the opinion that it should be Blackfoot Glacier, since that would honor all the tribes of the Blackfeet Nation, the Pecoonies, the Bloods, and the Blackfeet tribe. The name met with immediate approval, and the mountain on which the glacier lay was named Blackfoot Mountain. During the summer of 1891, I planned the next trip to the St. Mary's Valley. I was dining with 2 of my Yale friends, William H. Seward III, grandson of Lincoln's Secretary of State, and Henry Stimson, who was Phi Beta Kappa while at Yale. The 2 men became excited at my description of my upcoming trip. In a letter to Apecony, I told him that Mr. Stimson and his partner will be joining us in September. I arrived at Billy Jackson's cabin on the 1st, and Stimson and Seward arrived 2 days later. 3 days after their arrival, we set out along the mountainside for the upper St. Mary's River. On Goat Mountain, 2 of the horses missed their footing and rolled down the mountainside from the trail, but fortunately were not injured. After considerable labor, we got them back on the trail. Working up the river, we found a beautiful falls. The St. Mary's Falls are hardly more than a mile above the lakes. The following day, we moved up the river, but we made only 7 or 8 miles. We had spotted another glacier while higher up, and now we finally reached the foot of this new glacier. I named the glacier Stimson Glacier and its mountain, Mount Stimson. The next morning, while we stayed in camp, Seward and Stimson went ahead on their own with the purpose of hunting goats on a tall, pinnacled mountain. About sunset, we heard shooting on the mountain above the camp and could see where the young men were shooting at goats on the rocks far above them. They fired 15 or 20 shots at long range, but killed nothing. The goats apparently had never heard guns before, and they did not know what the noise meant. 2 goats at which they were firing became confused and jumped about, not understanding the dust and the sounds of the balls which struck near them. 1 goat refused to run until he'd been shot at 6 or 8 times. He then climbed, but only slowly. On greeting the 2 men upon their return to camp, and after we had stopped laughing, I told them that I had named the mountain Fusillade Mountain for the multitude of shots they took without success. The following day, Jackson and I climbed the big timbered shoulder that divides the forks. That's Fusillade Mountain. The following day, Jackson and I climbed the big timbered shoulder that divides the forks of the St. Mary's River. We reached the foot of another high mountain about noon and presently began to climb it, reaching the top just after 3 o'clock. I told Jackson that I was going to name the mountain after him. From the top of Mount Jackson, we could see new mountain peaks never seen from below. I named the most imposing peak Mount Reynolds for Charles Reynolds of Forest and Stream Publishing Company. On September 17th, I remained at a new friend, Henry Norris's cabin. I had met him 2 years ago to do some writing. It was on this day that I made in my notebook this entry. How would it do to start a movement to buy the St. Mary's country, say 30 by 30 miles, from the Piegan Indians at a fair valuation and turn it into a national park, a reservation? Stimson left us on September 25th to catch the railroad. Apicuni and I left for the Swift Current Valley. While there, Seward and I started on foot for Mount Allen, a huge mountain across the valley from my glacier. And after some hours of slow, bad climbing, we found ourselves in a pretty little rock basin. Across this basin, sleeting on the slide rock, was a goat which we hunted with success. And the goat posed for a photograph. And you'll notice Seward's rifle behind the goat. Cutting it up, we started down the mountain in the middle of the afternoon. Seward carried the hide and one shoulder. I carried the hams and saddles, say 50 pounds to each load. I named the mountain Mount Allen after his sister. We finally reached camp shortly after dark, and I received a letter from Seward early next year in which he recalled,
I, of course, remember being with you on Cataract Creek and the incident in naming Mount Allen, where we killed a mountain goat. The mountain was named after my sister, Cornelia Seward Allen, who is the granddaughter of Lincoln's secretary in his cabinet, William Seward. If I'm not mistaken, she still has the goat skin and head, which I had made into a rug for her upon my return.
our team of men with outdoor experience accomplished much on this trip, largely due to Billy Jackson's good nature and my profanity pulling us through. Apicone looks back on the trip with entire disgust for the reason that nothing was killed except one sheep and a goat or two. And as he wrote to Jack Monroe,
We live principally on mush and glaciers.
the truth is, I was able to name several features and map much of the area in both the St. Mary's and Swift Current valleys, and to take courses on distant but known mountains for my map. Jackson and Schultz scouted the area that we needed to visit in order to allow me to make my field maps. Jackson and Hugh Monroe educated us in the ways of the Blackfeet Indians. All in all, 1897 will be looked on as a very beneficial year. In the early summer of 1897, Jack Monroe and I started from the railroad for the St. Mary's Lakes and then to the extreme head of the St. Mary's River. There we made a quick rush and climbed Mount Jackson, probably the highest peak in that section of the Rockies. While on the summit, we discovered a glacier that we had not seen before. It lay on the southwest slope of Mount Jackson. We named it for a friend of Jack's, a respected rancher from Babb at the entrance to the Swift Current Valley. His name was Frank Harrison. On another trip in the autumn of 1897, a different group of men was camped next to Grinnell Lake. Around the campfire, the men were singing the then popular song, Over the Garden Wall, when one of them remarked, "There's a wall we can't get over." The name was immediately applied to the ridge, the Garden Wall. The following year, I did not carry a gun or even take a fishing rod. I took only an alpine stock, a compass, and Stimson's level. With Jack Monroe, I climbed Mount Jackson and reached the summit. It was a clear day. When we got around to the north, we saw there a big mountain, higher than anything else in sight. This mountain we had never seen before, and it was evidently nameless. We asked each other what we should call it, and after a little discussion, I said, "Here, that's the biggest mountain anywhere about here. And President Cleveland is the biggest man in the country. Let's call it Mount Cleveland." Jack, who's a good Republican when it comes to voting, said,
Cleveland it is.
I then realized that in the past 13 years with my companions, I had named over 40 geological features. Memorize these. The names are on the test after this is over. In 1895, the government spoke to the Blackfeet Indians about purchasing the mountain portion of their reservation. After hearing of the government's interest in their mountain land, the Indian chiefs met and voted 16-5 to negotiate a sale of the western portion of the reservation to the government. The Blackfeet requested that their longtime friend, George Bird Grinnell, be a member of the negotiating committee. Joining me on the commission were Mr. Walter Clemens, a lawyer from Georgia, and William Pollock of the Indian Bureau. In a series of meetings to discuss the sale, the Indians wanted $2 million to sell the land and was told that the price was absurd. The government offered $1 million. After bickering more than 2 days, Little Dog, a chief, demanded $3 million, which was refused. Little Dog declared,
It is useless to meet again.
The commissioners hinted that they would leave. By 9 o'clock that night, the Indians were sorry for their folly and desperately afraid that the commissioners would go away. The Indians spent the next day in council. On September 25th, everybody was ready to talk. White Calf, chief of the Piegans, who later adopted me into the tribe, asked for $1.5 million for all the mountains south to Birch Creek. Birch Creek was one of the southern border options. The offer was accepted. Over 300 of the adult Indians, of 381 eligible to sign, signed the agreement. The land would be open to prospecting and settlement on April 15th of 1898. On that date, over 500 people rushed into the area to stake out their claims. In time, however, little of precious metals or oil had been found. By 1910, the mining and oil exploration efforts in this area were finished. I had approached Senator Thomas Carter of Montana to introduce legislation to create a national park. In 1907, he did introduce a bill which was eventually defeated. It needed major rewriting. 2 more bills were introduced in the next 2 years. And finally, with some modifications, the last bill was approved by both the Senate and the House. The bill was sent to President Taft, who signed the bill on May 11th, 1910. Glacier National Park was now officially created. The Great Northern Railway went to work immediately in 1910, building 2 hotels and 8 chalet groups. The chalets were completed first, with the Glacier Park Hotel open to receive guests in June of 1913. A Park Saddle Horse Company was ready for business in 1912. The many glacier hotels seen here in the Swift Current Valley was opened in 1915. The White Motor Company of Ohio became the sole supplier of buses in the park. The first buses held only 7 passengers. Years later, the new buses were built to hold 17 passengers and had a retractable canvas roof for better sightseeing. Boats for the large lakes were introduced in 1910, first on Lake McDonald and later on the St. Mary's Lakes, Swift Current Lake, and Lake Josephine. Lake Josephine is the name applied to 6th Lake. Both the government and the Great Northern built roads beginning 1911. In a brilliant move, the Great Northern hired the Blackfeet Indians to greet their passenger trains and to entertain the guests at their hotels. By 1913, the park was completely open for business. I wrote to a friend.
On one occasion
Wrong friend, sorry. I'm sorry, folks, we're having a little trouble.
1915,
Did you get rid of me,
No?
or am I?
Why don't you go back to screen share? It might have, your cursor might have hit the stop share.
Sorry, everybody.
It's okay. So you want to go, yeah.
Okay, I wrote to a friend. It is, of course, a lovely country, but how much better it was before the public got into it. That, however, is a selfish way to think of the matter. As things are today, thousands enjoy it against tens that went there in the earlier days. In an interview with my wife, Elizabeth, she told this story.
on one occasion in 1915, a park official who did not know of Dr. Grinnell's intimate knowledge of the terrain told him that he could not make a certain trip without a guide. My husband immediately telegraphed Washington, and word came back promptly that he was to be allowed to go anywhere in the park he pleased.
I continued to make annual trips to Glacier National Park, and Elizabeth often accompanied me. When staying in the park, we often checked into the Mini Glacier Hotel, which was conveniently located close to my glacier. Can you imagine $7 for a room? That's outrageous. In 1923, we left New York City by train to travel to the park. A couple of days after our arrival, we started for my glacier on horseback. At the south side of Lake Josephine, we crossed at its head, climbed the trail, and had lunch at the springs. Then we continued our climb. I had to stop rather often to get my wind. Elizabeth had no disposition to go further, but I told her that she must at least stand on the glacier. A member of our party, Mr. Heilman, who was the official photographer of the Great Northern Railway, took a number of photographs. We got on the ice and walked slowly and carefully up to its highest point. Mr. Heilman took our photo standing on the glacier. You might notice a discrepancy in the ages of myself and my wife. When we married in 1902, I was 53. She was 24. Just thought I'd throw that in. In 1925, I was invited to the White House with two other people who stood up, listened to a speech by the president, and received a medal. It was more or less of a function at which 75 or 100 people were present. President Calvin Coolidge remarked,
"You were with General Custer in the Black Hills and with Colonel Ludlow in the Yellowstone. You lived among the Indians. You became a member of the Blackfeet tribe. Your studies of their language and customs are authoritative. Few have done so much as you. None has done more to preserve vast areas of picturesque wilderness for the eyes of posterity in the simple majesty in which you and your fellow pioneers first beheld them. The Glacier National Park is peculiarly your monument."
The medal I received is the Theodore Roosevelt Medal for Distinguished Service. I'm sorry that my friend Teddy could not be here to give it to me in person. The medal is big enough to knock a man down, and I suppose is actually something to be gratified about. July 11th, 1926, I arrived at the Many Glacier Hotel about 5 o'clock. I will meet Dr. Morton Elrod, the naturalist of the park, at the hotel. He is due here again in 2 days and proposes a trip to the glacier for the next day. About 11 o'clock Thursday, we started for my glacier. Mr. and Mrs. Noble of the Great Northern, Mrs. Binder, Miss Kenny, Elizabeth, and I rode and then walked up to the ice as usual. Much ice from 3 years ago is gone. A swift guide who I had met at the hotel previously, Hans Reiss, had been coming down off the ice with another party, and Elrod asked him to go back with us. He did so, and when we got on the ice, he roped us together, all except Elrod, who took photographs. We wandered to the rock wall, formerly covered with ice, and then along the length of the glacier, which is still an immense mass of ice. By this time, I was very leg weary. I fell down twice. Everybody was sympathetic about my progress. I knew that this would be my last visit. After reaching the horses, we had some coffee and ate part of the lunch left here when we started. We mounted the horses and trotted all the way back to the hotel. Well, I have had barrels of fun in my life. In fact, I suspect there is no one living who ever had so good a time in his life. I remember lodges pitched on the plains, camps by the Republican River, the Platte, the Loup, the Running Water, the Missouri, where with those friends, red and white, and here in the glacier area where I had hunted and feasted.
Aside from Grinnell's prophetic vision, his forthrightness, his scholarship in the field of zoology and Indian ethnography, and the drive that empowered him to carry so many causes to successful conclusions, his outstanding personal characteristics was that of never-failing dignity, which was doubtless parcel of all the rest. To meet his eye, feel his iron hand clasp, or hear his calm and thrifty words, even when he was a man in his 9th decade, was to conclude that here was the noblest Roman of them all.
Now, don't I look like him?
Indeed, you do.
I would be delighted to answer any
You really
questions.
do.
Did
Thank you
you-
very much. It was a wonderful look into your uncle or your cousin's book. How are the glaciers doing now? Have they changed a lot in the last 100 years?
Yes, they have. When Bird Grinnell was there in 1885, it was estimated there were 125 to 150 glaciers, and they define a glacier as having a surface area of at least 25 acres. Now, there are only 25 left that have a surface area of 25 acres. But you can see several of them in your visits there.
Hugh, while people are asking questions, do you have a business card or something to put up on the screen if anybody's interested in your book?
Well, yes, I do. Thank you. First of all, I want to explain everything I talked about today. This photograph down here came from his daily field journals, his published articles, and his personal correspondence, approximately 4,500 words. The book was made up of the same sources, but it's 55,000 words. I basically glossed over this story to keep it within a reasonable time for presentation. But the book has so much more. It's very, very detailed. So if you have an interest in discovering more about the book, my phone number and email are there. And it would be better for you to initiate the contact, and I will give you all the details. Part of it will be my address. You're going to have to send me a check. And then, of course, I'll want to find out your address. So we will do all of that by email or by telephone.
Hugh, there's a question. When do you feel is the best time to visit the park?
Well, the only time you can visit the park is roughly the middle of June to the middle of September, because the snow in Montana is so treacherous and so deep, you can't get into the park. So it's possible to go there in the fall, but not enter the park itself, but you'll see the gorgeous surroundings.
Mhm.
The middle of June to about the middle of October are the times to plan, and you need to plan about a year ahead.
Yeah.
You need to make reservations?
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you're going to stay in the park,
Yeah.
there are 3 hotels in the park, and there are 2 or 3 motels in the park. There are a lot of campsites, but they fill up rather quickly.
Yeah.
So you need approximately a year to make those reservations. But there are a lot of places to stay in Kalispell and West Glacier, which are just outside the park.
Mhm.
And I'm a great source of information, where to stay and what to see and what to avoid.
There's another question from David. Where did Grinnell make his full-time home?
He was born in Brooklyn. At age 7, his father moved the family from Brooklyn to Upper Manhattan. James Audubon had an estate there. He had 4 houses built for his family and his 3 sons. But when Bird Grinnell moved there as a 7-year-old, Audubon was already dead. But his wife, Lucy Audubon, who everybody called Grandma, was a teacher. So he was educated in her home until he started preparation school before going to Yale in 1870. And he retained his residence in New York City all his life.
Did he go? He went back and forth between the park and then back to New York?
Oh, yes. At that time in 1870, there was railroad running from the East Coast to as far west as like Omaha. And then the Northern Pacific went as far as Helena, Montana. But there was no transcontinental railroad at the time. But over the time that he traveled, those railroad lines were expanded. And so it made it easier.
Okay, here's Gail Turner She said, I had the distinct pleasure, hold on. We should stop this screen share because you'll want to, let's see, she got to meet you. She met you. They were both guests at Jacobson's on Flat Lake. Let's stop the screen share so you can see her.
Stayed at the Jacobsons at Flathead Lake. And you came in, I think, the day we were leaving.
I believe, yeah, I believe so. I think we had dinner together the one evening, and then yeah.
Oh yes, I do remember.
Yeah, because then Jake took you to the train the next morning, I believe.
No, we had a rental car.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, it was great fun.
Well, perfect. Thank you for
Yeah, and then my friend and I did go, made the trip up to Glacier that next day and saw the they had a big poster, of course, announcing your lectures and so on. So that was great fun.
Mm-hmm.
Real pleasure.
It was really enjoyable.
Well, thank you.
I've been to Glacier twice. I spent a week in Great Falls, and one of the days we went from the west. But I've been on a trip where I came in from the east. I'm sorry, I was on another trip that I came in from the west. So I've been there twice, met in the middle of Logan Pass, and came back, but never all the way across. Then another time went to Waterton. Yeah, absolutely gorgeous place. And thanks so much for doing it. So interesting. Really, really wonderful.
Well, I wanted to make sure, this is a little plug for the book, but I wanted to make sure that there's enough information in there that reading the book, people are going to know just where they visited, where the mountains or streams are located. I've got them all identified near lakes or near other mountains, so that if you've been there, you'll say, yeah, I've been there. I remember that.
Yeah, I remember St. Mary's Lake, where you took the first picture. That's where our group had our group picture taken.
Right.
And it was freezing, and the little red buses were still there.
Are they?
Lots of road construction. We had plenty of time to just stop and get out while they were, had one-way traffic or something. So summer is when they fix all the roads. So that's what you're up against.
Hugh, here's another question. What did your relative do for a living, and did he contribute any exhibits at the Yale Peabody Museum?
That's a terrific question. When he graduated from Yale in 1870, he had a degree in ornithology and paleontology. And that summer, there was a Yale professor, Othniel Marsh, who led a student paleontology expedition to the west, which was Nebraska, Wyoming, Kansas, and areas around there. And he has more exhibits at the Yale Peabody Museum than any other person because of all the things he discovered. And I was fortunate several years ago to visit the museum, and because of being a cousin, they took me down into the well, I don't know what they call it, down in the caverns or whatever. And they had shown a skeleton, a complete skeleton of a crocodile that he had found. Well, the crocodile was a miniature. It was about 18 inches long, but it was an adult. And I knew about it, and I was interested to see it, and I held it. And I have photographs, which I can't show you now, but I have photographs of that crocodile. But he had things from Blackfeet Indians, from Cheyenne Indians, and he's loaded the Peabody Museum with things that he bartered for, things that he discovered, and he's the most prolific provider to the Peabody Museum.
Interesting. And what did he do? I mean, did he earn money with anything at the park, or did he have another income source?
Well, fortunately for him, his father was more than a millionaire. He was a stockbroker, and one of his clients was a fellow by the name of Vanderbilt. And another one was of the same type. Anyway, so he had money coming, so he was never hurting. But he and his father bought more than 50% of the stock of Forest and Stream magazine. So that was his source of income. And he built that up to a point where it had the third largest circulation of any magazine or newspaper in the country.
Wow. Wow, interesting. Is that in your book as well?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
great, great. Well, it is after 8 o'clock, and which is our official time to close. Hugh, thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful presentation. Thank you for dressing up like him and giving the presentation in first person. That was really fun.
I dress this way all the time.
It's a good look.
Oh, card to put up.
I'm sorry?
My business card, there it is. If people want to copy down phone number or email.
Well, and also you can always look him up on the website. You can go to the map and type in his name and click on it, and it'll take you to his profile, and we'll give you that information too.
It's true.
Yeah.
Kathleen, I'm
Yes.
just wondering how many of us that were listening to him have actually visited already Glacier National Park and maybe seen some of those peaks that he mentioned.
Yeah.
I don't know. I had.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
wanted to mention, we're up here in Canada, and if anyone doesn't really want to climb mountains or climb glaciers, there are easier ways to do it. In Jasper National Park, you could actually get on these like snow monster trucks and ride across the glacier.
Athabasca. Mhm.
And then Kluane National Park in the Yukon, we took a tiny 4-seater airplane over the whole Lowell Glacier and got to see Mount Logan, the highest point in Canada. And that was one of the highlights of our life. It was an amazing.
I think Glacier National Park is probably one of the most magnificent parks in the United States. It's breathtaking. It's so big, and you don't know when you see all these signs, should I or shouldn't I, or should I keep going? So I think, you know, because they take you on all these other side roads. And today I learned a lot, you, from what you said, because some of the signs we didn't follow and some we did. It's so big. When you're, you know, you can't see it all. You can see parts of it.
Well, you can't see it in a day or two. You need 4 or 5 days to
That's
really
right.
see it.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's 1 million acres.
Oh, wow.
I was a child when I was there. My parents took us, we always took a trip in June, usually for about 2 weeks. And we did do that area, and I was in Glacier National Park. I have pictures in my mom's photo albums, obviously black and white pictures with my brother and I standing by some of those things that you saw. So I appreciate that. It brought back memories from my childhood.
Good.
Thank you.
Can everybody see Billy's picture that he's got up? Billy, you need to say something so it'll show up.
Where?
Billy Warwick.
Oh, Billy. Oh, there it is. Yes.
I don't see.
Yeah, that's the way we went. Down.
Yeah, the little red buses. Well, they still
Yes,
have-
great way to travel.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm impressed you could find the picture just quickly. All right.
I think there's a lot to be said for staying in the lodges in the park. And I think that you feel the rusticness of the park when you stay in the lodges. And you do have to make your reservations in advance, but I think it's really worthwhile doing.
It sure is.
Could you get?
You're muted, David. David, you're muted.
I was hoping I could get one of those rooms at the lodge for $7 a night. Could you? Could you help me get one of those rooms for $7 a night?
Yeah, sure I can. You buy about 25 books and I'll get you a room for $7.
Okay. That'll work. That'll work.
Well, that's great. Well, everyone, next week, so we'll have, let's see, next week is the 22nd. next Sunday. And so we're going to talk about your special Thanksgiving traditions. That was a great topic that was suggested last week. And, if you have pictures to show that you could hold up, or things, or just, whatever your family has done as a tradition that you think others might like to know about, we would love to have that shared. Or even if it's recipes that are dishes that are really good. So,
Have you heard about the popcorn dressing?
Popcorn dressing? No.
You stuff the turkey with unpopped popcorn and all the breading, and when it gets hot enough and the popcorn blows the penny off the turkey, it's done.
Seriously?
Are you kidding?
I don't know. I can be gullible.
We fill our turkey with propane. It does the same thing, but quickly.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Would it be okay if we just share a memorable Thanksgiving? Maybe not a tradition, but a memorable one that.
Sure. I think everybody, we're going to have to kind of gauge how many people have stuff to share, because, so we have time for everybody to share.
We might have to go over time a little bit.
You're going to talk the whole time, David? You've got some good stories?
No, definitely not. I have a story that I'll share, but I love to hear the other stories that the other people share with me. And I plan on being silent and share mine maybe last, because I love the stories that this group shares, the places that they've gone, things they've seen, and the stories that they share. So I would rather listen to them.
Wow. Well, I'm looking forward to next week, and I believe we have someone sharing a recipe. I think Esther Cope is gonna be sharing a recipe. So, and we'll see. We can always have that flexible. If we don't have time to do that, we can move that to another week. So, well, thank you all again, and I look forward to seeing you next weekend. All righty, take care.